morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Wherever you might be around the world, I'm super excited to be talking about automation today and opening up the event today. So, I've been very fortunate to have had the opportunity to work with many organizations in my career that are, going through the process of modernization. And modernization is really, as we all know, an ongoing thing. When I was early in my career, I thought it was a one-off thing. But no, it's been going on for the last 20 years or so that I've been working, and everyone is continuing to modernize. And in doing so, are automating their processes, automating the capabilities they have in order to get better, in order to be able to deliver better services. So I thought today, I'll talk a little bit about some of the things I've seen work well in terms of enabling organization to modernize better and automate better, and therefore become better organizations overall. And I thought, there's no better way of doing that than in the model of the 7 habits from Stephen Convey, and talking about the 7 habits that I've seen at least work best. So without further ado, let's get started. Let's start with the first habit, which is seek first to understand and then to automate. And to talk a little bit more about this habit, I'm going to start with a quote from none other than Bill Gates. He said, "Automation applied to an inefficient operation will magnify the inefficiencies." This is interesting because basically he's saying automation is not a silver bullet. If you don't understand the underlying processes, the capabilities you want to automate, the outcome you want automation to achieve for you, then you're really not going to get that much benefit, or maybe even go backwards in just introducing automation. So don't automate for the sake of automating. To show this, and talk about how automation sometimes starts with purely manual processes in the back, but starts by actually abstracting through a service interface the capabilities that you do want to introduce automation for, so that first you can better understand what needs to be automated. I'm going to use the trial service. Here at Kong, we have a free trial. And one of the things we've been seeking to do has been to improve the experience for that free trial by introducing automation. So let me talk about how we approach this. So first and foremost, we knew that the service was clear. Somebody wants to come in and they want to use our service, to use Kong and get access to Kong, get their hands on Kong and be successful as soon as possible. And the very first thing we did was first expose that service on our website and say, okay, well, let's start with a fully manual process. And that, at a high level, included 3 things, starting with provisioning. So we needed to provision an instance of Kong and make sure the users have access to it, because we want it to be a cloud-based experience to make it quicker, smoother, all the properties associated with a cloud-based experience. Second, when the users were going through the testing and kicking the tires, we wanted to make sure we answered the questions. So we introduced chatbot interactions. And then in the chat box, we had people, humans, so mechanical Turk model actually answering the questions. But the provisioning, by the way, in the first phase was manual as well. And then the conversion to paid through the chat box, we would go through our process and pay and get the user a paid account. Now, that was, notice, felt like automated process to the service consumers, but actually pretty much fully manual in the back. Now, where we're at today is the second phase, where we have automated the provisioning. We now have some common chatbot questions automated. So if the user is on a particular screen and asking a very common question that we know confidently that we can automate the answer to without causing more problems or without confusing matters more, we've actually then automated that aspects, but still we have humans in the back. And then the conversion to paid, still manual. Now, of course, we can go ahead and make that conversion to paid be also automated, and we will be doing that. But the chat box is an area where we feel we're not going to get to a point where it's going to be fully automated, because a fully automated chat box will likely lead to frustration, and that's not necessarily a great thing. Which brings me back to the point of this particular habit, which is don't automate just for the sake of automating. And to bring it back to Bill Gates, we started with Bill Gates with an example that sheds some good lights on the company, but perhaps on Microsoft, perhaps an example that doesn't shed such great light on Microsoft is Clippy. Good old Clippy. Some of you might remember was introduced in 1997 with Office 97. And this is, I think, an example where automation wasn't really successful, right? If you look at the Wikipedia entry for Clippy, there are words like strong negative reaction or a tragic misunderstanding associated with poor old Clippy. And I'd like to step back and think about why this automation was unsuccessful. And I would like to propose that the reason why it was unsuccessful is because the folks who thought about it and who introduced it were mostly introducing automation for the sake of automation or coolness factor perhaps, but not thinking about the ultimate goal. And what do I mean by ultimate goal? So we know we don't want to automate for the sake of automating. I would argue that automation for the sake of purely achieving competitive differentiation or purely for introducing efficiency might also not be the best goal. I think that's a better goal just for the sake of automation. But then the ultimate goal is really automation for the sake of improving the experience of the end users interacting with your services and the people providing your services. And Clippy obviously didn't really achieve those goals. Now, if we fast forward to where we are today, of course, a remote medicine is playing a critical role in our day-to-day lives nowadays. And that automation is probably a good example of one that has allowed us to have a better experience for both the providers and the consumers of the service. And here's an example, I think, of an automation that takes that habit well, which is don't just automate for the sake of automating. Let's go to the second habit, be service obsessed. And here, let me start again with another quote from Jeff Bezos this time. Jeff Bezos, I think some of you might know, issued a famous memo in 2002, which some argue was the beginnings of what led to the creation of Amazon Web Services. Is a 6-point memo. It starts with this point: all teams will henceforth expose their data and functionality through service interfaces. Such a powerful phrase. And here what Jeff was saying basically was that you ought to think about your services. What most programmers know, what the best programmers always know, is that you got to expose functionality through loosely coupled, highly cohesive interfaces. But he was saying what the novelty was that every team within the organization needs to think of itself almost as a programming function, and think of the service they're providing as a very clear interface. Now, fast forward to where we are now, and essentially the whole thing has been fully consumerized. We think about a lot of the things we do as services. I love the example of a sprinkler system. Nowadays, you can turn on your sprinklers wherever they might be in the world for the people who have multiple sprinklers or sprinkler providers, and have an experience that is fully service-driven, that is delightful, right? And so what's interesting, though, is that if you then look at that high-level service and go behind the scenes, what you will notice is that it's not just that one service, it's multiple services, it's dozens of services. If we look at the sprinkler service here, the sprinkler apps being used by the actual consumers, the devices need to talk to the service. There's a layer of APIs behind the scene that are fronting that, but behind the scene, because of modern application architecture and the concept of microservices, you have many, many other services, which each of them have to be thought of as a full-fledged service. So you have this hierarchy of services that need to have well-defined and well-tended to service interfaces. For our Sprinkler service, you're thinking at least, where the services, in this case, there are the red dots, at least a dozen or so services involved. Let's move to our third habit. So if that wasn't obvious from my previous example, the service interface is critical, right? How you define that interface, that contract in that interface becomes critical. And a good example of that to me is our car. Day to day, when we get into our car, the interface to the car is a pretty clear service interface. When the light goes on for the oil, you know that there is automation involved in here, but you know how to interact with the automated service. You don't have to understand exactly how the car engine works, but you know that you have to fill up the oil, and you could do it yourself. If that other icon goes on, well, in that case, you know that for most people who are not as well versed in car mechanics, you will not know what to do. And therefore, at that case, that light indicator is a clear indication that this particular automation, the car, needs to be brought to the service provider, the mechanics, so that they can then use their instruction manual to the engine abstraction and therefore prepare the car. Again, the interface has exposed the automation in such a way that is usable, but the criticality of the interface and its clarity is what matters here. Now, bringing this to our world of APIs, our world of microservices, it all comes down then to the contract, to the spec, right? And this is becoming more and more important because the spec is not just anymore RESTful interfaces, is gRPC interfaces, is asynchronous API interfaces, and other types of protocols like GraphQL. And for every one of those, the clarity of the documentation of the spec is critical. And in some ways, this is UX for interfaces. UX is often associated with graphical user interfaces for applications, but UX is very much also present for contracts for interfaces that are programmatic in nature. Developers are humans too, and they need to have an interface that is intuitive, that is delightful, that tells them when something goes wrong. Is it the oil light where they can do something about it? Or is it the exclamation point mark on the car engine where they can't do anything about it and the backend service is effectively non-functional? That type of clarity needs to expose itself in the service interface itself. And tools such as Insomnia, which is, as you all know, is a tool that Kong provides, enable, we designed these tools to enable developers who build interfaces and developers who consume interfaces to be able to get to a point where their contracts are more clear and more easy to consume and develop and provide. Let's go to the fourth habit. And this one is decentralize, an important one in today's world where we are dealing with an explosion of services in the back. A service is no longer just an island. It's not a service with a single interface and that's it. Inside that service, again, we're dealing with hierarchies. One top level service is composed of many different groups of services, which might in turn be consisting of many different groups of services. And outside of that service, you have other clusters of services that need to be interacted with. You have edge services that are trying to consume different types of top-level services, partner applications that need to expose those, and customer applications that need to consume these services. So a service is not an island. And what I found happens is that the very fact that, okay, well, I have my purview of a service, and the group of service that form the top highest level service that we as a team control. Great, we can manage that. But now to expose that service to all these external entities I talked about, one of the things that often happens is that people think centralized, right? And you end up having to go expose that service through perhaps a centralized gateway or API team that is then able to make sure that service is exposed with the right level of security. That team is able to make sure that the service is well documented enough, that it's exposed in the right portals, and so on. The problem with this model is that that centralization, that central gateway team who owns all of the central gateway infrastructure, ends up being, what in the good old days we would call a SPOB and a spot. So a central point of traffic and a central point of bottleneck. And that is not good. And a central point of failure, SPOF as well. And that is not good. That leads to a ticket-based process. Every team for every service they want to expose would have to wait days, if not weeks, to get that service exposed. The changes have to be serialized. Really feels slow, brittle, less secure, and frustrating. And so the question has to be, in this world where services are ubiquitous, where every service, every application is consisting of dozens of services, where the success of any organization depends on how quickly they can deliver reliable, secure services that are well documented with clear interfaces. How can we move forward without this experience, without this type of frustration? And really, I think we feel at Honk here that the answer is decentralization. Every team ought to be able to deliver a well-secured, well-documented, easily published to a portal where it's readily discoverable service by themselves, parallelized in 100% automated way with CI/CD based change management. And that is what we strive to achieve with Kong's capabilities, and we feel generally, regardless of the solution used, the vendors use, is the way to go in the future, given the number of services we're dealing with. And in this case, you're going to end up with a much more adaptable world where each team can expose interfaces without breaking other people's interfaces in parallel, a more resilient world because they'll have more time around thinking about how well these services are defined, how well their contracts are defined, some of the habits we've discussed so far, and even more secure. And therefore, if you will, I would like to say Zen, perhaps a more Zen world that we're dealing with here. All right, habit number 5, think more carrots than sticks. For this, I'd like to bring my favorite pet peeve here, which is expense filing. I've had the pleasure to work with many different expense systems in the past. And, some feel like a stick-based approach for sure. And it's a dread to ever have to think about filling your system because you have to go through dozens of screens. You have to struggle with these screens. And then once you have spent all this time, you have to go and scan manually your paper receipts and attach them to email, copy the actual correlation ID, send that thing over. And then what you find out after a couple of days is that you missed a particular date or something, and you have to go redo the whole thing. That's a stick-based governance. And that's a stick-based automation, which really end to people unwillingly or maybe non-maliciously trying to shortcut the system, right? And then leads to a worse outcome for both ends, like the service providers and service consumers. In startup world nowadays, most people start using Expensify, which is a much more carrot-based approach, right? I can just scan my receipt and it just gets filed for me. It just goes in the right report. And if there's issues with it, the policies are checked against that particular expense right away. And I know that there might be issues and I can fix them right away. Why couldn't we do something like that? In fact, we can do something like that for programmatic service interfaces as well. and make sure that all services as they're being developed are being following the right model, helping developers apply secure practices, for example, right from the beginning. And therefore, it's a carrot-based approach. You're helping them deal with things they don't really want to deal right up with by themselves, but helping them with the actual capabilities right up front. And so moving to this carrot-based approach is our fifth habit, which brings me to developers. Developers are critical. Developers are the people who are writing the services, the people who are building the capabilities and encapsulating the business logic into these services. And making sure that the developer experience is clean, the developer experience is not filled with obstacles becomes critical. And so what does this mean in today's world? Really, you know, I still write code for fun, although my code hasn't gone to production, you know, God willing, for a while now. But you know, the purest form that I can explain what the ideal developer experience is that developers like to first and foremost, you know, use their favorite IDE to just focus on business logic, and then the only tool they really don't mind using is Git. You know, let me check in, let me do my PRs, and otherwise make sure the rest of the things happen automatically, right? And so oftentimes, unfortunately, they're encumbered though with many other things that we have to, that are introduced in their day-to-day thinking that really remove that focus from the interface design, from the business logic, and therefore lead to inefficiencies in our modernization journey. Now, here at Kong, one of the use cases that we think about every day is the use case of end-to-end automation of change management, especially around service interfaces. This is something we call the golden use case, which is developers focus on the business logic and the service interface. They commit their changes, and then the CI pipeline takes on. It verifies the interfaces. It lets them know right away. In fact, earlier on, even there, the tooling should let the users know if there's things that ought to be wrong or could be wrong. And then automatically deploys the services to the right place, and the ops folks can monitor that the right way. And the way we do that with our tooling here at Kong is through the tools that you see in this screen. Insomnia is our tools for enabling developers to have a more delightful experience in being able to design and consume well thought out interfaces. We have everything in CI/CD based tools to be able to automate the deployment to Kubernetes or non-Kubernetes environments, to be able to automate the publishing to a portal. Even from Insomnia, developers can browse documentation of existing services from that given portal. And also, if there's the documentation, remember that habit about the contract being key? If that contract is inaccurate, we have a technology called Kong Brain that's able to detect inaccuracies and let developers know that the documentation is inaccurate. And then finally, on the upside, that's outside of the developer's scope. We make sure that there's monitoring capabilities, integration into existing monitoring, as well as our own monitoring capabilities to ensure that the service is running at scale and in a healthy manner, and anomalies are detected. Which brings me to the very last habit, Sharpen the Saw, which is the same habit as Stephen Conway had in his book, which really, I think, applies the same way here. These are the 6 habits. They're very hard. We all, you know, everyone is going to have to work hard on these. It's not things that just happen. And there are hierarchies of improvement, right? You can get better at each of these habits every day. So the advice here is, take any given habit, take the small changes you can do to improve on any one of these, and slowly but surely you'll get better at each of them, and together they ought to improve our overall automation journey, which really should lead to a better experience for everyday life for all of us. And with that, let me conclude here and pass it back to the team. It was a pleasure to be here, and I very much appreciate all of you, the community at Kong, all of the customers, and everybody else in our ecosystem. Thank you very much.